What do the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and the world's first known legal code, have in common? They both come from a civilization that once stood at the crossroads of empires, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place the ancient world knew as Babylon. But Babylon was far more than its gardens or its myths. For over 1,000 years, it rose and fell, was conquered and reborn, ruled by kings whose names still echo through history: Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus. It was a city of laws, learning, and gods, a city that shaped the very foundations of civilization. This is not a tale of legend or fantasy. This is the entire story of the Babylonians. Long before Babylon rose to power, long before its name echoed across ancient lands, the region of southern Mesopotamia was already a cradle of human civilization. Here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, some of the earliest urban societies took shape. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu were already thriving when Babylon was still little more than a village. The people of this region were the Sumerians. By the end of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, they had developed writing, built monumental architecture, and organized complex religious and political systems. Their language, unrelated to any other known tongue, dominated the cultural landscape of Lower Mesopotamia for centuries. It was the Sumerians who laid the foundations, literally and culturally, for every civilization that followed in the region, including the Babylonians. Babylon itself, located in central southern Mesopotamia, began as a modest settlement. It lay along a canal connected to the Euphrates River, strategically positioned between major Sumerian and Akkadian centers. Its location would later prove crucial, giving it access to trade, agriculture, and influence. The earliest known mention of Babylon appears in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era during the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari of the Akkadian Empire. That empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2300 before the Common Era, was the first to unite much of Mesopotamia under a single ruler. Sargon's empire had established a political structure that many later kings, including the rulers of Babylon, would emulate. But Babylon at this time was not yet a major power. During the Akkadian and early post-Akkadian periods, it remained a secondary settlement, overshadowed by more established cities like Kish, Nippur, and Ur. These cities were not only wealthier, but also spiritually significant, housing important temples and cult centers dedicated to gods such as Enlil, Inanna, and Nana. After the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2100 before the Common Era, brought on by internal instability and external invasions from mountain tribes known as the Gutians, Mesopotamia entered a period of fragmentation. City-states reasserted their independence, and a new dynasty rose to prominence in the city of Ur. This was the 3rd dynasty of Ur, often referred to as the Ur III period, lasting from around 2100 to 2000 before the Common Era. The rulers of Ur III, especially Shulgi, implemented a highly organized bureaucratic state. They built roads, standardized measurements, and issued decrees across their territory. But even during this time of centralization, Babylon remained relatively quiet in the historical record. It was likely administered as a provincial town under the authority of Ur. However, the fall of the Ur III dynasty around 2000 before the Common Era created a new power vacuum. The causes were complex. Pressures from the Elamites in the east, incursions by Amorite tribes from the west, and perhaps internal economic challenges. As the centralized state collapsed, dozens of smaller political entities began to compete for dominance. This is the moment when Babylon began to emerge. The Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people originally from the western deserts and highlands of Syria, had gradually moved into Mesopotamia over the previous centuries. At first seen as outsiders or even nomadic raiders, they slowly settled in cities, assimilated local customs, and began to rule. By the early 19th century before the Common Era, Amorite leaders had taken control of many key Mesopotamian cities. In Babylon, a man named Sumu-Abum established a dynasty around the year 1894 before the Common Era. He is traditionally considered the founder of the First Dynasty of Babylon. Not much is known about his reign, but his assumption of power marked a turning point. From this moment forward, Babylon had its own rulers and its own ambitions. Sumu-Abum's successors would gradually increase Babylon's influence. They engaged in local power struggles with neighboring cities like Isin, Larsa, and Eshnunna, all of which were ruled by their own Amorite dynasties. These early Babylonian kings did not yet command a vast empire, but they began to lay the groundwork for future expansion. They fortified the city, consolidated control over the surrounding countryside, and established Babylon as both a political and religious center. The city's patron deity, Marduk, gained prominence during this period. Although Marduk was originally a minor local god, the Babylonian rulers began elevating his status, linking his rise to the city's growing power. This relationship between the city and its god would become central to Babylonian identity in the centuries to come. The early First Dynasty also saw the development of administrative institutions that mirrored earlier Sumerian and Akkadian models. Babylonian scribes used cuneiform script, and both Sumerian and Akkadian languages continued to be used for official records. Trade networks extended through the region, connecting Babylon to markets in Elam, Assyria, and beyond. Archaeological evidence from this period is limited, but it points to steady urban development. The construction of temples, walls, and canals shows that Babylon was transitioning from a provincial town into a true city-state. Its leaders understood the value of infrastructure, religion, and political symbolism. By the time Hammurabi came to power in the early 18th century before the Common Era, Babylon was ready to take a much more prominent role in regional affairs. The city had the institutions, the resources, and the strategic position necessary to challenge its rivals. The path from humble village to powerful capital had been slow and uneven. But it was during this formative period, through centuries of cultural inheritance, migration, and political change, that Babylon developed the identity and foundations that would allow it to become a great imperial power. By the dawn of the 19th century before the Common Era, the political landscape of Mesopotamia was deeply fractured. The collapse of the centralized Third Dynasty had given rise to a competitive environment in which numerous city-states, each with their own Amorite dynasties, jostled for control. It was in this context that Babylon's fortunes began to shift, no longer a minor provincial town, but a city poised for prominence. The Amorites, originally nomadic tribes from the western fringes of Mesopotamia, had by this point embedded themselves firmly into the region's political fabric. In city after city, Larsa, Isin, Eshnunna, and eventually Babylon, they had assumed power, blending their heritage with the long-established traditions of Mesopotamian kingship. Babylon's transition to Amorite rule marked a turning point not only in its own development, but also in the shaping of a broader Mesopotamian identity that now reflected this fusion of Semitic and Sumerian Akkadian elements. The man credited with establishing Babylon's First Dynasty was Sumu-Abum, who reigned beginning around the year 1894, before the Common Era. Although there is little direct information about his reign, his actions laid the foundation for an enduring line of kings. What distinguishes this moment in Babylonian history is not the scale of its power. Babylon was still a relatively minor player, but the fact that the city now had an independent dynasty capable of long-term political planning and ambition. Sumu-Abum's successors continued the work of strengthening Babylon's position in the region. His immediate heir, Sumu-La'el, appears to have initiated campaigns aimed at expanding Babylon's control over nearby territories, including critical towns and agricultural regions. The goal was clear: secure food supply lines, consolidate military power, and assert control over important trade routes. These conquests were not sweeping or dramatic, but they were deliberate and strategic. The succeeding kings, Sabium, Apil-Sin, and Sin-Muballit, continued this process of steady expansion. Through calculated military actions, political marriages, and administrative integration, Babylon grew from a local power into a regional force. Each ruler inherited a slightly stronger kingdom than his predecessor, with improved infrastructure, growing religious prestige, and more sophisticated governance. One of the major developments during this early phase of the First Dynasty was the growing centrality of the god Marduk in Babylonian religion. Although Marduk had started as a relatively minor deity, successive kings elevated him to the status of city patron, a role previously held by gods like Enlil in Nippur. This was not merely a religious choice, it was a political move. By promoting Marduk and gradually aligning him with older, more dominant gods, Babylon's rulers were crafting a divine legitimacy that would support their rule and distinguish Babylon from its rivals. At the same time, these kings reinforced their authority through the traditional tools of Mesopotamian kingship, temple building, canal construction, and legal reforms. These were not innovations, but they were essential symbols of a ruler's competence and favor with the gods. Babylon's prosperity depended on managing the delicate balance of river irrigation, and investment in agricultural infrastructure paid dividends in population growth and economic stability. By the reign of Sin-Muballit, Babylon's position had become increasingly secure. He ruled for several decades during the early 18th century before the Common Era, overseeing continued development of the city and its outlying settlements. His most significant contribution, however, may have been his son, Hammurabi. Hammurabi would become the most famous Babylonian king of all time, but it is important to recognize that his rise was only possible because of the groundwork laid by his forebears. By the time Hammurabi inherited the throne, Babylon was no longer an isolated city-state. It was a formidable power with a strong administrative core, a rising religious profile, and an expanding network of loyal territories. But the regional picture remained complicated. The power struggle between city-states was far from over. Larsa, in the south, under kings like Rim-Sin, remained a dominant force. To the northeast, Eshnunna continued to compete for influence, while in the northwest, Mari controlled critical stretches of the Euphrates River. The kingdom of Elam to the east remained a potential threat, and Assyria in the north, although not yet at its imperial height, was a growing concern. In this volatile environment, diplomacy and warfare often went hand in hand. Babylon's kings relied not only on force, but also on careful alliances. There is evidence that marriages between royal families were used to secure peace or cooperation. At other times, treaties were signed, only to be broken when the balance of power shifted. These early kings operated in a world where loyalty was fragile and strength was the key to survival. One important pattern during this period was the increasing use of written legal and economic documents. Clay tablets in cuneiform script recorded transactions, agreements, legal rulings, and religious donations. Babylon's administration grew more complex as its territory expanded. Bureaucracy became a necessity, and the scribes who maintained these records held considerable influence. These tablets also tell us about the concerns of daily life, disputes over land, contracts between merchants, and rules governing labor and property. Although Hammurabi's law code would later become the most famous example of Babylonian legal tradition, its roots were already present in these earlier documents. They reflect a society trying to impose order in a world where uncertainty was common. The evolution of Babylon into a fully formed city-state with growing regional power was not inevitable. It required decades of careful leadership, strategic thinking, and adaptability. What set Babylon apart was not just its location or its military. It was the ability of its rulers to shape a coherent political and religious identity that could compete with much older and more established centers. By the time Hammurabi ascended the throne, Babylon had moved from the margins of Mesopotamian politics to the center of a new emerging order. The city was fortified, the administration was mature, and the ideology of kingship was firmly grounded in both divine favor and legal authority. When Hammurabi came to the throne of Babylon in the early 18th century before the Common Era, few could have predicted the scope of his future impact. At the time of his accession, Babylon was a respectable regional power, stronger than in previous generations, but still surrounded by formidable rivals. Within a few decades, Hammurabi would not only consolidate much of Mesopotamia under his rule, but also introduce a legal code that would echo through history for millennia. Hammurabi ascended the throne around the year 1792 before the Common Era, succeeding his father Sin-Muballit. He inherited a growing but still relatively modest kingdom. His early reign focused on internal consolidation. Rather than launching immediate military campaigns, Hammurabi strengthened Babylon's infrastructure, improved irrigation systems, and invested in the temple economy. These efforts secured food production, stabilized the administration, and increased his legitimacy as a ruler favored by the gods, especially Marduk, the city's chief deity. The geopolitical environment surrounding Babylon remained tense and unstable. To the south, the city of Larsa, under the powerful Rim-Sin, controlled much of the agriculturally rich land and remained Babylon's primary competitor. To the northeast, Eshnunna held sway over important trade routes. Mari, along the middle Euphrates, controlled communication lines with Syria and the Levant. And to the east, the kingdom of Elam loomed as a potential threat. Hammurabi's genius lay in his strategic patience. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he avoided large-scale warfare, focusing instead on diplomacy and gradual territorial gains. He forged temporary alliances with neighboring states and cultivated ties with distant powers, carefully observing the shifting balance of power. When opportunities arose, he acted decisively. The turning point came when Hammurabi aligned with Mari and Elam to challenge Larsa's supremacy in the south. Rim-Sin had ruled Larsa for nearly 60 years and had long been a dominant figure in southern Mesopotamia. In one of Hammurabi's most important military campaigns, he launched an offensive that culminated in the conquest of Larsa around the year 1763 before the Common Era. This victory marked a major shift. Babylon now controlled the fertile south, including important cities such as Uruk, Ur, and Isin. It also meant the absorption of Larsa's economic base and religious centers. With southern Mesopotamia under his control, Hammurabi then turned northward. His former allies soon became targets. He defeated Eshnunna, subduing its rulers and absorbing its territories. In a bold and decisive move, he launched a campaign against Mari, whose king, Zimri-Lim, had once been an ally. Mari fell, and its palace, famous for its archives and administrative sophistication, was burned. Though some scholars debate whether Hammurabi intended to destroy the city permanently or only punish its leadership, the outcome was clear. Babylon was now the dominant power from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. What Hammurabi created was not merely a patchwork of conquered cities. He sought to centralize his authority and bring ideological coherence to his expanding realm. This ambition culminated in his most enduring achievement, the Codex Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a tall basalt stele and placed in public view, contained nearly 300 laws addressing everything from property disputes and trade to marriage, labor, and criminal justice. It was written in Akkadian, the language of administration, and designed to be accessible, not in the sense that all citizens could read it, but in that its public display signaled the king's commitment to justice. The prologue of the code offers insight into how Hammurabi understood his role. He claimed to have been chosen by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. This idea, that the king was both divinely sanctioned and morally responsible, would shape Babylonian political thought for centuries. Many of the laws reflect a strict system of justice based on social hierarchy. Penalties varied depending on the status of the offender and the victim. For example, injuring a nobleman might warrant a harsh punishment, while the same offense against a slave could carry a lesser penalty. The principle of lex talionis, commonly summarized as an eye for an eye, appears in several clauses, though always tempered by class distinctions. The code also reveals a complex economy. Laws regulated interest rates, crop failures, debt obligations, and commercial transactions. Others governed family life, including inheritance, adultery, and divorce. In total, the code was a reflection of a society that was highly organized, legally sophisticated, and deeply concerned with maintaining order. Though Hammurabi was not the first Mesopotamian king to issue laws, earlier rulers like Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar had done so, his code was far more comprehensive and symbolic. It was not only a legal document, but a political statement, unifying the diverse peoples of his empire under a single set of principles. Beyond law, Hammurabi also engaged in large-scale building projects. He restored temples, improved canal systems, and fortified city walls. These efforts served both practical and ideological purposes. They demonstrated the king's care for his subjects and his relationship with the gods. Temples, in particular, were centers of economic and religious life, and their restoration reinforced Hammurabi's status as a pious and capable ruler. Hammurabi ruled for more than 4 decades. By the end of his reign, Babylon was the undisputed center of power in Mesopotamia. Its god Marduk had risen to supremacy among the pantheon, and the city itself had become a religious and administrative capital. But like many empires built by a single charismatic leader, Hammurabi's state did not long survive his death. His successors struggled to maintain the territorial integrity he had achieved. Within a generation, rival powers began to reassert themselves. Invasions from the east and unrest in the provinces slowly chipped away at Babylon's dominance. Yet the cultural and ideological legacy of Hammurabi endured. His code continued to be copied and referenced for centuries. His example of kingship, divinely guided, morally justified, and legally grounded, would influence later rulers not only in Mesopotamia, but across the ancient Near East. Hammurabi became a model king, remembered not merely for his conquests, but for his governance. The empire that Hammurabi forged was vast and complex, stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in the east and the Euphrates Corridor in the west. But as is often the case in history, what one generation builds, the next must struggle to hold. After Hammurabi's death around the year 1750 before the Common Era, Babylon began a slow but steady descent into instability. Over the course of the following century, the First Dynasty of Babylon weakened, fragmented, and ultimately fell, undone by internal challenges, external invasions, and the sheer difficulty of managing a diverse and expansive empire. Hammurabi was succeeded by his son, Samsu-iluna, who ruled for nearly 3 decades. The challenges facing Samsu-iluna were immediate. Though he inherited a powerful empire, it was stitched together by recent conquests, fragile alliances, and local leaders who had only recently been subdued. Loyalty was thin, and resistance quickly emerged. Early in Samsu-iluna's reign, a major rebellion erupted in the south. Cities that had been absorbed during Hammurabi's campaigns, such as Uruk, Isin, and Ur, rose in revolt. These revolts were not minor disruptions. They were large-scale uprisings that threatened to pull the entire southern half of the empire away from Babylonian control. The motivations were both political and economic. Local elites resented Babylonian centralization, while the economic burdens imposed by the empire, such as taxation and forced labor, fueled popular resentment. Samsu-iluna responded with force. His armies suppressed the rebellions and destroyed key cities to prevent further resistance. The city of Uruk, once a jewel of Sumerian civilization, was so thoroughly sacked that it never regained its former importance. But the cost of these campaigns was enormous, both materially and psychologically. The resources needed to wage war against subjects drained the treasury, and the destruction of cities weakened the southern economy. Meanwhile, new threats were emerging. From the southeastern marshlands of Lower Mesopotamia, a rival power began to rise: the Chaldean Dynasty. This little-known kingdom, likely led by local elites who had resisted Babylonian control, managed to carve out a sphere of influence in the swampy and hard-to-reach areas near the Persian Gulf. Though never fully understood, the Chaldean rulers posed a serious challenge to Babylon, controlling important waterways and trade routes. Babylonian kings would attempt for generations to dislodge them, but with limited success. In the north and northeast, Babylon also began to lose ground. The kingdom of Eshnunna, briefly subdued by Hammurabi, regained its independence. Other city-states followed. The geopolitical unity that Hammurabi had enforced was fracturing quickly, and Samsu-Iluna spent much of his reign simply trying to hold together what remained. The reigns of his successors, Abi-Eshu, Ammi-Ditana, Ammi-Saduqa, and Samsu-Ditana, continued this pattern of gradual decline. Though these kings maintained the appearance of control, real power was slipping away. They focused increasingly on religious observance, legal continuity, and infrastructure projects, but were largely unable to reverse the fragmentation. Ammi-Saduqa, who reigned near the end of the dynasty, is particularly notable for his religious and astronomical records. His reign produced detailed observations of the stars and planets, part of a growing Babylonian interest in celestial phenomena. These early records would later form the foundation of Babylon's famed astronomical tradition. Yet while the temples of Marduk remained active and the scribes recorded celestial events, Babylon's grip on the wider region continued to loosen. By the time Samsu-Ditana, the last king of the dynasty, took the throne, Babylon was a weakened state, isolated and vulnerable. Around the year 1595 before the Common Era, a major external threat emerged from the north: the Hittites. The Hittites, an Indo-European people from Anatolia, had been expanding their influence across northern Syria. Led by King Mursili I, a Hittite army marched down the Euphrates and launched a surprise attack on Babylon. In an event that stunned the ancient world, the Hittites sacked the city. They plundered its temples, seized its wealth, and then retreated north. They did not stay to rule Babylon. The campaign appears to have been a highly organized raid rather than an occupation, but the damage was done. The Hittite raid shattered what remained of the First Dynasty. Samsu-Ditana's reign ended with the fall of the city, and with it the dynasty that Hammurabi had once made great. Babylon was left leaderless and exposed. It would be several years before a new ruling power could establish authority there. In the aftermath of the Hittite attack, Babylon entered a period of chaos. The political vacuum left by the fall of the First Dynasty allowed various groups to compete for dominance. Among them were the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east. Though they had long been known in Mesopotamia, often serving as mercenaries or border settlers, the Kassites now began to assert themselves more aggressively. But before they could fully take control, Babylon would experience further instability. The Sealand dynasty in the south continued to operate independently, and other minor dynasties may have ruled the city in the interim. This was a period of fragmentation and uncertainty, a dark age, at least in terms of surviving records. The collapse of the First Dynasty of Babylon illustrates several important themes in ancient history. First, it shows how quickly an empire can unravel after the death of a strong leader. Hammurabi's centralization efforts, while effective in the short term, had not created durable institutions capable of surviving beyond his reign. Second, it demonstrates the limits of military power. While conquest could bring cities into the fold, it could not ensure lasting loyalty without administrative integration and local support. Finally, the fall highlights the constant pressures from both internal divisions and external invasions that defined life in ancient Mesopotamia. Despite the fall, the legacy of the First Dynasty lived on. The cultural, legal, and religious developments of the Hammurabi period remained embedded in Babylonian society. Later, kings would look back to this dynasty as a model of legitimacy and divine favor. As Babylon began to recover under new rulers, it entered a new phase in its history, one marked by Kassite control, long-term stability, and a surprising cultural revival. In the aftermath of the Hittite raid on Babylon and the collapse of the First Dynasty, the city was left fractured and politically vulnerable. Yet within this period of disruption emerged one of the most stable and enduring regimes in Babylon's history, the Kassite Dynasty. For more than 4 centuries, Kassite kings ruled Babylon, making their dynasty the longest in its recorded history. Though less glamorous than Hammurabi's reign, this era was vital for rebuilding the city, preserving Mesopotamian traditions, and laying the groundwork for Babylon's future revival. The Kassites were a people of uncertain origin, believed to have come from the Zagros Mountains region to the east of Mesopotamia. They had been present in Mesopotamian military and political life for generations, often serving as mercenaries or minor officials. Following the political vacuum left by the fall of the First Dynasty, the Kassites gradually asserted control over Babylon and the surrounding areas. Their rise to power was not sudden. It unfolded over several decades during a time of regional instability. By the early 16th century, before the Common Era, a Kassite king named Agum II, often identified as Agum Kakrim, had firmly established Kassite rule in Babylon. He portrayed himself as a restorer of order and piety. One of his most symbolic acts was the recovery of the statue of Marduk, which had been taken from Babylon during the earlier period of conflict. Returning this image to its temple was more than a religious gesture. It was a political statement aimed at legitimizing Kassite rule and linking it with the revered Babylonian past. The Kassites were careful not to present themselves as conquerors. Instead, they adopted Babylonian culture, language, and administrative practices. They maintained the use of Akkadian in their official records and continued to venerate the traditional Mesopotamian gods. Temples and religious institutions remained central to Kassite governance, and the priesthoods retained their privileges and responsibilities. One of the most important aspects of Kassite rule was its administrative stability. The dynasty established a centralized system of governance with provincial governors, tax collection systems, and state-sponsored temple economies. Land grants became a common tool of statecraft. The kings often awarded tracts of land to loyal officials, soldiers, or priests in exchange for service. These grants were recorded on kuduru stones, elaborately carved boundary markers that also included curses against anyone who tried to alter or revoke the arrangement. These stones have provided modern historians with valuable insights into Kassite society and law. Despite their foreign origins, the Kassite kings gradually became indistinguishable from their Babylonian predecessors. They took Babylonian names, married into local elites, and participated in Babylonian religious festivals. Their reigns were often long and uneventful, a sign of political continuity rather than stagnation. Economically, the Kassite period was marked by recovery and steady growth. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, with the rebuilding of irrigation canals and reclamation of abandoned lands. The Kassites also expanded Babylon's trade networks, connecting it with regions as far away as the Persian Gulf, Anatolia, and Egypt. Babylonian goods, such as textiles, grain, and crafted items, were exchanged for metals, timber, and luxury goods from abroad. One of the most striking aspects of this era was Babylon's participation in international diplomacy. During the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era, Kassite Babylon maintained relations with other great powers of the Late Bronze Age: the Hittites, the Mitanni, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians. These relationships were formalized through correspondence, gifts, and royal marriages. Several letters from Kassite kings appear in the Amarna archive, a collection of diplomatic texts found in Egypt and dated to the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. These letters show Kassite rulers addressing the pharaoh as brother and exchanging valuable goods such as lapis lazuli, horses, and gold. The tone of the correspondence reflects an international system based on relative equality among kings, a kind of ancient balance of power in which Babylon played an active role. Culturally, the Kassite period saw continuity rather than radical innovation. The scribal tradition remained strong, with ongoing copying and preservation of earlier Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Kassite kings sponsored the rebuilding and expansion of temples across Mesopotamia, particularly in Babylon, Nippur, and other major religious centers. Nippur, sacred to the god Enlil, remained a vital spiritual and scholarly hub. In art and architecture, Kassite contributions were subtle but distinctive. Cylinder seals from this period show detailed iconography, often blending Mesopotamian motifs with unique Kassite symbols. Temples and palaces used traditional forms, though regional styles varied depending on local resources and traditions. One notable Kassite innovation was the widespread use of the aforementioned kuduru stones. These artifacts combined legal, religious, and artistic elements and became a unique Kassite contribution to Mesopotamian material culture. The boundary stones not only recorded land grants, but also included astronomical symbols, divine emblems, and protective curses. The Kassite period was not without challenges. There were occasional conflicts with Assyria and Elam, both of which sought to expand their influence. Border skirmishes, diplomatic tensions, and temporary occupations occurred, but the Kassite kings generally maintained control over Babylon and its core regions. However, by the late 13th century before the Common Era, signs of decline began to appear. Internal weaknesses, shifting trade networks, and mounting external pressures undermined Kassite authority. The regional balance of power was changing. The Hittite Empire was in decline. The Mitanni had been absorbed by others, and Assyria was becoming more aggressive and expansionist. In the 12th century before the Common Era, Babylon faced a renewed threat from Elam. Under the leadership of Shutruk-Nakhunte, the Elamites launched a devastating campaign into Mesopotamia. Around the year 1155 before the Common Era, Elamite forces captured Babylon, looted its temples, and carried off sacred statues, including the image of Marduk. This event marked the end of the Kassite Dynasty. With the fall of the Kassites, Babylon entered another period of political fragmentation and foreign dominance. Yet the accomplishments of the Kassite era were not erased. The dynasty's long rule had preserved Babylonian cultural identity, sustained economic life, and maintained religious traditions. It had kept Babylon alive during a critical phase of recovery and transition. Despite being outsiders, the Kassites had become deeply woven into the fabric of Babylonian civilization. Their legacy, though sometimes overlooked, was one of restoration and endurance. As the Kassite dynasty brought stability to Babylon, the broader landscape of the Near East was shifting dramatically. This period, known to historians as the Late Bronze Age, was marked by the rise of powerful kingdoms vying for dominance across the region. Egypt to the southwest, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, and Assyria in the north. Babylon, now under Kassite rule, found itself both shaped by and deeply involved in this intricate web of diplomacy, rivalry, and occasional war. Among Babylon's most significant external interactions during this era were those with the Hittites. The Hittite Empire had expanded rapidly out of central Anatolia under kings like Suppiluliuma I and Mursili II, establishing themselves as a major force across the northern Fertile Crescent. Though the Hittites and Babylonians were geographically distant, their interests often overlapped, particularly through shared allies, contested territories, and regional diplomacy. Direct military conflict between Babylon and the Hittites was rare during the Kassite period. The famous earlier Hittite raid on Babylon, carried out by Mursili I and resulting in the fall of the First Dynasty, had not been followed by permanent Hittite occupation. In the Kassite era, hostilities were more indirect, and Babylonian interaction with the Hittites often took the form of diplomacy and cultural exchange. This period also witnessed a significant shift in the nature of international relations. The great powers of the Late Bronze Age established what scholars often describe as a diplomatic club of kings. This informal system included Egypt, Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylon. These kingdoms treated one another as equals, and their interactions were guided by carefully worded correspondence, royal marriages, and mutual gift exchanges. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt and dating to the 14th century before the Common Era, offer a rare and detailed glimpse into this diplomatic world. Within this archive are several letters from Babylonian kings to the Egyptian pharaohs. The tone of these letters is formal but cordial. Babylonian rulers address the pharaohs as brother, a term used only among rulers considered political equals. These communications reveal much about the concerns of Late Bronze Age monarchs. Babylonian kings requested gold, horses, and luxurious textiles from Egypt. In return, they sent lapis lazuli, fine garments, and trained horses of their own. Diplomatic marriages also occurred, in which Kassite princesses were sent to foreign courts as part of alliance-building strategies. However, Babylonian kings occasionally complained that their gifts were not being reciprocated with equal value, suggesting the importance of honor and parity in this international system. While Babylon and the Hittites were generally cautious in their dealings with one another, tensions did occasionally rise. The borderlands between Babylonian and Hittite spheres of influence, particularly in northern Syria, became areas of strategic competition. Cities like Katna and Aleppo shifted allegiances depending on the balance of power. Babylonian rulers sought to maintain their interests without provoking open war, and for the most part, these disputes remained at the level of maneuvering rather than invasion. More broadly, this era was one of remarkable cultural exchange. Babylonian scribal practices, religious concepts, and legal traditions influenced neighboring cultures and were, in turn, shaped by them. Akkadian, the language of Babylonian administration, became the lingua franca of diplomacy across the Near East. Hittite officials and Egyptian scribes were trained to read and write in cuneiform. Treaties between states, such as the one between Hatti and Egypt following the famous Battle of Kadesh, were often recorded in Akkadian, even if neither party spoke the language natively. Babylon's religious and literary prestige also contributed to its cultural influence. Texts such as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth centered on Marduk, were copied and circulated in royal libraries outside Mesopotamia. The story's themes of divine order, cosmic conflict, and political legitimacy resonated widely. Babylonian divination and astrology likewise spread throughout the region as rulers sought to understand the will of the gods and predict future events. While the Hittite heartland was located far to the northwest of Babylon, the two civilizations shared surprisingly similar religious features, including a complex pantheon and the idea of divine kingship. Hittite kings, like their Babylonian counterparts, often portrayed themselves as chosen by the gods and responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Some scholars suggest that Babylonian myths and rituals may have had an indirect influence on Hittite religious traditions. Trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf ensured the flow of goods and ideas. Babylonian artisans produced high-quality pottery, textiles, and metalwork that reached distant markets. In return, they imported timber from Lebanon, horses from the steppe, tin from the east, and luxury items from as far away as Egypt and Cyprus. Despite these flourishing connections, the stability of the region was not guaranteed. The Late Bronze Age was a time of prosperity, but also of growing tension. Assyria, which had once been a minor player, was becoming more assertive. The Mitanni kingdom, long a buffer between Babylon and the Hittites, was in decline. As power dynamics shifted, Babylon had to navigate an increasingly precarious diplomatic environment. Babylonian kings responded by strengthening internal administration and cultivating relations with multiple powers simultaneously. They rarely engaged in large-scale wars during this period, instead favoring negotiation and alliance building. This approach preserved Babylon's autonomy and allowed it to maintain a leading role in the region without overextending its military resources. By the end of the 13th century, before the Common Era, the balance of power was beginning to erode across the Near East. Signs of strain appeared as trade networks faltered, internal revolts broke out, and external pressures mounted. The eventual collapse of the Hittite Empire and the widespread disruptions of the 12th century before the Common Era, sometimes referred to as the Bronze Age collapse, would have profound consequences for Babylon and its neighbors. But during the centuries preceding that upheaval, Babylon stood as a diplomatic and cultural beacon. It had recovered from conquest, rebuilt its institutions, and earned a place among the great kingdoms of the ancient world. Its kings corresponded with pharaohs, exchanged gifts with Anatolian rulers, and preserved a tradition of learning that would survive even as empires fell. As the 13th century before the Common Era gave way to the 12th, the long-standing Kassite Dynasty in Babylon began to falter. For more than 400 years, Kassite kings had maintained relative peace and continuity, integrating themselves into the Babylonian world and governing with a mixture of foreign origin and local adaptation. But the regional balance of power was shifting, and Babylon could not remain immune to the rising pressures. The weakening of Kassite authority did not occur overnight. It was the result of a slow erosion of influence, marked by both internal vulnerabilities and increasingly aggressive external threats. Babylon had weathered centuries of geopolitical challenges, but the final decades of Kassite rule saw the convergence of multiple destabilizing factors. One of the most serious threats came from the east, the Kingdom of Elam. Situated in the region corresponding roughly to modern-day southwestern Iran, Elam had long been a regional power in its own right. For centuries, Elamite rulers had alternated between trade and war with their Mesopotamian neighbors. However, by the late 13th century before the Common Era, Elam was undergoing its own resurgence, becoming militarily ambitious and politically assertive under a series of strong rulers. The most consequential of these was King Shutruk-Nakhunte. His reign marked a turning point in Babylonian-Elamite relations. Instead of merely raiding border territories or acting as a peripheral nuisance, Shutruk-Nakhunte launched a full-scale invasion of Babylonian territory with the goal of breaking Kassite power. The motivations behind this campaign were not solely expansionist. Shutruk-Nakhunte framed his invasion in religious and ideological terms. He claimed to be acting on the will of the Elamite gods, punishing Babylon for perceived offenses and restoring divine justice. This rhetoric was typical of ancient kings, who often used divine sanction to legitimize military action. In this case, it also served to justify the plundering of Babylon's religious and cultural treasures. The campaign proved devastating. Elamite forces advanced deep into Mesopotamia, targeting not only military strongholds but also religious centers. The city of Babylon itself was captured. The Elamites looted the great temples, seized ritual objects, and carried off religious statues, including the revered image of Marduk. This act was more than symbolic. It struck at the heart of Babylonian identity. The removal of Marduk's statue was seen as a sign that the gods had abandoned the city, a spiritual crisis as much as a political one. The Kassite king Enlil-nadin-Ahi, who had ruled during this final period, was defeated and likely taken to Elam, where he may have died in captivity. His reign marked the end of the Kassite Dynasty, closing a chapter that had begun more than 4 centuries earlier with cautious consolidation and careful cultural integration. Following the Elamite Conquest, Babylon descended into a period of political fragmentation. For several years, there was no dominant dynasty, and control of the city changed hands multiple times. The vacuum left by the Kassites drew in new factions, including local leaders, former provincial governors, and rival powers. The power of Elam itself began to wane not long after its triumph. The occupation of Babylon was short-lived, and the Elamites were eventually driven out. However, the damage they had inflicted was lasting. They had disrupted Babylon's administrative structures, humiliated its priesthood, and shaken its political foundations. In the wake of this chaos, a series of short-lived dynasties attempted to restore order. These included the so-called Second Sealand Dynasty, which ruled from the southern marshlands, and the Isin Dynasty, which tried to reassert control over central Babylonia. Each of these attempts was local and limited in reach. None were able to unify the region in the way the Kassites had. The Isin dynasty in particular made notable efforts to revive Babylonian prestige. Its kings emphasized their ties to ancient traditions, restored temples, and issued royal inscriptions that claimed continuity with the past. Yet, these efforts were reactive rather than visionary. They sought to rebuild what had been lost rather than innovate or expand. The center of gravity in Mesopotamia was shifting, and Babylon found itself struggling to remain relevant. Meanwhile, to the north, Assyria was growing in strength. Under kings such as Ashur-uballit and Tukulti-Ninurta, the Assyrian state was becoming more centralized and militarized. Unlike earlier centuries, when Assyria had been one of several regional powers, it was now positioning itself as an empire. Babylon, weakened and divided, was increasingly vulnerable to its northern neighbor. Indeed, Assyria would soon assert dominance over Babylon, launching its own campaigns and installing puppet rulers. But that story belonged to the next phase of Babylonian history, a phase defined not by independence, but by rivalry, rebellion, and repeated struggles to reclaim autonomy. The fall of the Kassite Dynasty, then, marked a fundamental transition. It was the end of Babylon's longest era of political stability and the beginning of a much more turbulent period. The cultural achievements of the Kassites, the international diplomacy they engaged in, and the continuity they had provided all faded into the background as military power and dynastic legitimacy came under constant challenge. Yet even amid this collapse, Babylon's legacy endured. The memory of Kassite rule remained embedded in the legal and religious institutions that survived. The scribes continued to copy ancient texts. The priests continued to recite hymns to Marduk. And the city's people, despite invasion, occupation, and political uncertainty, kept Babylon alive. After the fall of the Kassite dynasty and the devastating Elamite invasions, Babylon entered a prolonged period of fragmentation. Several local dynasties attempted to reassert control, but none succeeded in restoring the kind of stability that Babylon had once known. At the same time, a new and increasingly dominant power was rising in the north, Assyria. Assyria had once been a modest kingdom situated in the upper Tigris region, but by the 12th century before the Common Era, it had begun transforming into a powerful state with expanding military ambitions. The Assyrians were aggressive, disciplined, and deeply committed to empire building. Their administrative innovations, military strength, and royal ideology positioned them as the central power in the Near East for centuries to come. As Babylon reeled from internal disarray, Assyria under Ashur-uballit I saw an opportunity. During the late 14th century before the Common Era, he intervened directly in Babylonian politics by installing his grandson as king. This move marked the beginning of a long and complex relationship between Babylon and Assyria, one marked by intermittent collaboration, forced vassalage, and violent rebellion. The first few Assyrian interventions in Babylonian affairs were relatively restrained. Assyria often worked through proxies, placing local rulers on the throne who were loyal to the Assyrian crown. These puppet kings offered nominal allegiance to Assyria, paid tribute, and adopted Assyrian-friendly policies. Yet beneath the surface, resentment brewed among Babylonian elites and the priesthood, who viewed these foreign-backed rulers as illegitimate. Babylon's religious culture remained a key element of its identity, and the role of Marduk as divine protector of the city was more than ceremonial. Any king who did not demonstrate proper reverence for Marduk risked losing the support of the powerful priesthood. This tension between native religious authority and foreign political control would become a recurring theme in Babylon's subsequent history. The instability of this arrangement became evident during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta, the first in the 13th century before the Common Era. Unlike earlier Assyrian kings, Tukulti-Ninurta took a more direct approach. He launched a full-scale military campaign against Babylon, captured the city, and declared himself king. In an act that shocked many, he plundered the temples and removed the statue of Marduk-to-Assur, the Assyrian capital. This violation of Babylonian religious tradition was deeply offensive to the population. It created outrage among the priesthood and the general populace alike. While Tukulti-Ninurta may have believed that transporting the statue would symbolize Assyrian superiority, it instead destabilized his rule. Babylonian resistance increased, and even within Assyria, his legitimacy suffered. Eventually, Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated, likely as a result of court intrigue and dissatisfaction with his harsh policies. After his death, Babylon regained a measure of independence, but the broader trend of Assyrian interference continued. Over the next few centuries, Babylonian kings alternated between brief periods of autonomy and stretches of vassalage. Assyria remained a looming presence, and Babylon's political reality was shaped by the need to navigate this powerful neighbor to the north. During the early first millennium before the Common Era, Assyria underwent a major transformation. Under kings like Ashur-Nasirpal II and Shalmaneser III, the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded dramatically. Its armies marched deep into the Levant, across the Zagros, and into Elamite and Babylonian territory. Assyria was no longer content with regional hegemony. It was building the first true empire of the ancient Near East. Babylon during this period was ruled by a series of native kings, many of whom tried to walk a fine line between acknowledging Assyrian supremacy and asserting their own sovereignty. One notable figure was Marduk-Apla-Iddina II, who ruled in the 9th century before the Common Era. He invested heavily in temple restoration, promoted Babylonian culture, and strengthened the priesthood. His reign brought a brief cultural revival, even as Assyria remained an ever-present threat. However, by the time of Shalmaneser III, Assyrian pressure intensified. Babylonian kings were increasingly forced to accept tribute arrangements and diplomatic subordination. Assyrian inscriptions from this period depict Babylonian rulers as dependent allies at best and rebellious subjects at worst. Babylon's geography made it both valuable and vulnerable. Positioned between major trade routes and controlling access to key agricultural zones, the city was too important for Assyria to ignore. Yet its strong cultural identity and religious significance made it difficult to absorb fully into the Assyrian imperial framework. Religious legitimacy remained a major battleground. Assyrian kings often attempted to associate themselves with Babylonian traditions, hoping to win local support. They restored temples, funded rituals, and even participated in Babylonian festivals. But these efforts rarely eliminated local resentment. Babylon's population viewed Assyrians as outsiders and their rulers as occupiers. This period also saw the emergence of a recurring pattern: Babylonian revolts followed by harsh Assyrian retribution. Whenever Assyrian control weakened due to succession crises, foreign wars, or internal revolts, Babylonian rulers would declare independence. When Assyria regained strength, it would send armies to crush the rebellion, depose the local king, and impose new conditions. One example of this cycle occurred during the reign of Marduk-Shumi I in the 9th century before the Common Era. He faced both internal opposition and external pressure from Assyria. Though he managed to retain power with Assyrian assistance, the cost was high. He became reliant on the Assyrian military, and Babylonian autonomy continued to erode. Despite these challenges, Babylon remained culturally vibrant. Temples operated, scribes continued to produce texts, and traditions were preserved. The resilience of Babylonian society during this time is remarkable. Even under foreign domination and political instability, the city maintained its role as a spiritual and intellectual center. As the 8th century before the Common Era approached, tensions between Babylon and Assyria would only increase. New dynasties would rise, foreign powers would intervene, and Babylon's desire for independence would spark a series of dramatic confrontations. By the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was entering a new and more aggressive phase of expansion. In previous generations, Assyrian rulers had relied on tributary arrangements, puppet kings, and periodic campaigns to maintain influence over Babylon. But under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria adopted a more systematic and direct approach, one that would alter the political structure of Babylonian society and further strain the already fragile relationship between the two powers. Tiglath-Pileser III came to the Assyrian throne in the year 745 before the Common Era through what was likely a palace coup. His reign marked a turning point, not just in Assyrian military affairs but also in imperial administration. He reorganized the empire into a series of provinces directly governed by officials loyal to the crown. This administrative reform allowed Assyria to extract resources more efficiently and suppress rebellion more effectively. The new model would soon be applied to Babylon. At the time of Tiglath-Pileser's rise, Babylon was ruled by Nabu-Nasir, a native king who had taken the throne during a relatively calm period. Nabu-Nasir was known for his efforts to preserve Babylonian culture and historical records. His reign coincided with a notable revival of interest in astronomy and timekeeping, and he initiated a chronological system that later scholars used as a foundation for dating historical events. Although Nabu-Nasir maintained nominal independence, the reality was that Babylon was already under Assyrian influence. Tiglath-Pileser launched several campaigns in the west and south, expanding Assyrian control over Syria and Palestine, while keeping a close watch on developments in Babylon. The Assyrian king presented himself as both conqueror and protector, bringing order to regions plagued by instability, but also demanding submission and tribute. When Nabu-Nasir died, Babylon entered a period of internal conflict. Competing factions vied for control of the throne, and Assyria saw an opportunity to deepen its involvement. Tiglath-Pileser intervened directly. In the year 729 before the Common Era, he invaded Babylon, deposed the local ruler, and proclaimed himself king of Babylon. This act was unprecedented. For the first time, an Assyrian king ruled Babylon in name as well as in practice. Tiglath-Pileser's assumption of the Babylonian crown was not merely a political move, it was also a religious and symbolic one. Babylon, with its ancient temples and revered priesthood, held immense cultural and spiritual authority. By becoming king of Babylon, Tiglath-Pileser sought to legitimize his empire, not just through force, but through association with Babylon's divine heritage. He participated in traditional Babylonian rituals, made offerings to Marduk, and upheld the calendar of local festivals. This strategy was partially successful. Some members of the Babylonian elite accepted his rule, seeing it as preferable to chaos or foreign meddling from other rivals, such as the Chaldeans or Elamites. The temples continued to function, and the economy remained active. However, resentment simmered below the surface. Many Babylonians still viewed Assyrian kings as foreign occupiers, and Tiglath-Pileser's reign did little to erase that perception. The Chaldeans, a Semitic-speaking people living in the marshlands of southern Babylonia, became increasingly important during this period. Though often labeled as tribal or semi-nomadic, the Chaldeans were politically astute and well integrated into Babylonian society. Several Chaldean leaders began to assert themselves as legitimate contenders for the Babylonian throne, especially during moments when Assyrian authority appeared to waver. One such figure was Ukin-Zir, a Chaldean chief who rebelled against Assyrian control shortly after Tiglath-Pileser's death in the year 727 before the Common Era. His revolt, though ultimately crushed by the Assyrians, signaled a growing confidence among the Chaldean factions and a deepening Babylonian desire for self-rule. Tiglath-Pileser's successors inherited both the crown of Babylon and the problems that came with it. The attempt to rule Babylon as a dual monarch, Assyrian king and Babylonian king, created contradictions that proved difficult to resolve. On one hand, Assyrian rulers were expected to uphold Babylonian traditions and maintain the temples. On the other, they also governed as imperial conquerors, extracting tribute and suppressing dissent. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III also had long-term consequences for the structure of Babylonian society. His administrative reforms in Assyria were mirrored in Babylon, albeit less successfully. Local governance was increasingly placed under the supervision of Assyrian officials, and regional autonomy was diminished. This centralization of power, while efficient for the Assyrians, alienated many Babylonian nobles and city leaders who had once wielded considerable influence. Economically, the period saw both continuity and strain. Agricultural production remained stable, thanks in part to Babylon's fertile land and well-developed irrigation systems. Trade continued through key routes connecting the Persian Gulf, the Zagros Mountains, and northern Mesopotamia. But the burden of tribute, the cost of maintaining a foreign administration, and the disruption caused by repeated conflicts all placed limits on prosperity. Culturally, the legacy of Tiglath-Pileser's reign was complex. While the Assyrians attempted to present themselves as legitimate rulers, their control over Babylon fostered a stronger sense of Babylonian identity in opposition to imperial rule. This contrast between occupier and native would shape political developments for decades to come. Babylonian scribes continued to record their history, Babylonian priests preserved their rituals, and Babylonian kingship remained a powerful ideal, even when the throne was occupied by a foreigner. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III marks a key moment in Babylonian history. It was a time when Babylon's political autonomy was significantly reduced, yet its cultural significance remained intact. Assyria may have held the reins of power, but it never fully conquered the Babylonian soul. The city continued to dream of freedom, and those dreams would soon find champions among a new generation of rebels, priests, and Chaldean leaders. Following the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, Babylon found itself in an increasingly precarious position. Though now formally part of the Assyrian imperial framework, the city remained a proud cultural and religious center with a population deeply resistant to foreign domination. Babylon's subjugation under Assyria was never fully accepted, and for many Babylonians, the dream of regaining independence endured. That dream would be kept alive, and at times almost realized, by a new force rising in the south: the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were a Semitic-speaking people who had long inhabited the marshy lowlands of southern Babylonia, especially near the Persian Gulf. While often described as tribal or nomadic, the Chaldean clans were politically sophisticated and economically influential. By the late 8th century before the Common Era, they had emerged as serious contenders for power in Babylon, supported by both their own resources and the growing discontent among Babylon's urban and rural populations. One Chaldean leader in particular rose to prominence: Marduk-Apla-Iddina II, also known in later Greek sources as Marduk-Baladan. His name would become synonymous with Babylonian resistance against Assyrian rule. Marduk-Apla-Iddina was a member of the Bit-Yakin tribe, one of the most powerful Chaldean groups in southern Babylonia. His early life is not well documented, but by the year 722 before the Common Era, he had positioned himself as a champion of Babylonian independence. That same year, Assyria was undergoing a leadership transition following the death of Shalmaneser V. Taking advantage of the political uncertainty in Assyria, Marduk-Apla-Iddina seized the throne of Babylon and declared himself king. His move was bold, and his appeal was immediate. Babylon's priests, scribes, and city dwellers welcomed him as a native ruler, in contrast to the foreign Assyrian kings who had attempted to impose their authority through military occupation and religious interference. Marduk-Apla-Iddina restored temples, reaffirmed the centrality of Marduk in religious life, and sought to re-establish Babylonian sovereignty. For a time, he succeeded. For nearly 12 years, Marduk-Apla-Iddina ruled Babylon independently, defying the expanding power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He forged alliances with neighboring states, including Elam to the east, and may have reached out diplomatically to kingdoms in the Levant. His reign represents one of the most significant attempts at resisting Assyrian dominance during the 8th century before the Common Era. However, the Assyrians were not idle. In the north, a new king had come to power, Sargon II. Sargon was one of the most capable and determined rulers of the Neo-Assyrian period. He immediately recognized the threat that Marduk-Apla-Iddina posed and launched a campaign to restore Assyrian control over Babylon. In the year 710 before the Common Era, Sargon led a full-scale military invasion into Babylonia. The decisive confrontation came near the city of Der, close to the Elamite border. Although Marduk-Apla-Iddina had allied himself with the Elamites and assembled a strong defensive position, the Assyrians ultimately prevailed. The Babylonians were defeated, and Marduk-Apla-Iddina fled into exile, likely seeking refuge among his Chaldean kin or across the border in Elam. Despite the loss, Marduk-Apla-Iddina's resistance left a lasting impression. For many Babylonians, he symbolized the possibility of self-rule, a native leader who had dared to challenge the might of Assyria and who, for over a decade, had governed independently. Sargon II, now in control of Babylon, attempted a more conciliatory policy. Rather than destroying the city or replacing its traditions, he presented himself as a legitimate ruler who respected Babylonian culture. He participated in religious ceremonies, restored damaged temples, and took the title King of Babylon in addition to his Assyrian throne. This approach aimed to legitimize Assyrian rule without provoking further rebellion. Yet the underlying tensions remained unresolved. When Sargon died in battle in the year 705 before the Common Era, Marduk-Apla-Iddina returned from exile and once again seized the Babylonian throne. His second reign was short-lived, lasting only around 9 months. but it reflected the deep and ongoing instability of Assyrian-Babylonian relations. The new Assyrian king, Sennacherib, responded with force. He led another campaign into Babylonia, defeated Marduk-Apla-Iddina once again, and expelled him from the city. This time, Marduk-Apla-Iddina's resistance was permanently ended. He vanished from the historical record, though legends of his defiance would echo for generations. Marduk-Apla-Iddina's struggles were part of a broader pattern in Babylonian-Assyrian dynamics during this era. Babylon remained a city deeply committed to its independence, while Assyria continued to impose its will through a combination of military intervention and royal propaganda. Each Assyrian king who claimed Babylon as part of his domain had to contend not just with rebellious armies, but with a population that never fully accepted foreign rule. After Marduk-Apla-Iddina's final defeat, Sennacherib took a far harsher stance than his predecessors. No longer willing to tolerate cycles of rebellion and reconciliation, he would later take drastic action to punish Babylon and extinguish its aspirations for independence, a dramatic decision that will be explored in the following section. The long-standing tension between Babylon and Assyria reached its most violent and symbolic climax during the reign of Sennacherib, one of Assyria's most powerful and controversial monarchs. After decades of rebellion, shifting alliances, and failed reconciliations, the Babylonian problem had become an intolerable burden for the Assyrian state. What followed was an act virtually unprecedented in the ancient Near East: the deliberate destruction of Babylon, a city long regarded as sacred, inviolable, and culturally central. Sennacherib ascended to the Assyrian throne in the year 705, before the Common Era following the death of his father, Sargon II. Though inheriting a vast empire, Sennacherib also inherited Babylon, a city repeatedly associated with rebellion and unrest. The memory of Marduk-Apla-Iddina's defiance was still fresh, and Sennacherib approached Babylon not with reverence, but with suspicion. Early in his reign, Sennacherib sought to reassert control over southern Mesopotamia. He quickly moved against Marduk-Apla-Iddina, who had briefly reclaimed the Babylonian throne after Sargon's death. Within a year, Marduk-Apla-Iddina was once again expelled, ending his political career. But Babylon remained unstable. Rival factions, Chaldeans, Arameans, Elamites, and loyalist Babylonian elites, all competed for dominance, often inviting foreign intervention and threatening Assyrian authority. Rather than allowing a native Babylonian or Chaldean ruler to fill the power vacuum, Sennacherib installed his own son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, as king of Babylon. This move, intended to ensure loyalty, only further inflamed tensions. To many Babylonians, the appointment of an Assyrian prince was a direct affront to their traditions. Though Assyrian kings had ruled Babylon before, placing a crown prince on the throne signaled permanent domination, not shared authority. Matters worsened when the Elamites, longtime rivals of Assyria, intervened directly. Around the year 794 before the Common Era, Elamite forces captured Ashur-nadin-shumi and carried him off to Elam, where he likely perished. The loss of his son enraged Sennacherib. It was a personal insult and a political disaster. In response, he launched a punishing campaign against both Elam and the rebellious forces in Babylon. This time, however, Sennacherib resolved to go beyond temporary suppression. His view of Babylon had hardened. It was no longer seen as a prestigious city that needed careful handling, but as a perpetual source of rebellion that required elimination. The solution he chose would shock even his contemporaries. In the year 689 before the Common Era, Sennacherib ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. According to his own inscriptions, his army flooded the city by diverting the waters of the Euphrates River. The temples were looted and razed, the statue of Marduk was removed, and the city was reduced to rubble. Buildings were dismantled brick by brick, walls were torn down, and the once great metropolis was left desolate. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe the event in terms of divine justice and military triumph. He claimed that the gods, angered by Babylon's repeated betrayals, had sanctioned the city's annihilation. He portrayed himself as an instrument of cosmic order, cleansing the land of rebellion. In his own words, he swept away the people like a hurricane and laid the city's foundations bare. But not all Assyrians agreed with this action. Within Mesopotamian religious thought, Babylon held a unique status. It was the city of Marduk, the king of the gods, and destroying it was seen by many as sacrilegious. Some Assyrian officials and priests likely viewed Sennacherib's actions with unease, if not outright disapproval. The desecration of sacred sites risked alienating the divine realm and offending a powerful deity. Indeed, Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon cast a long shadow over his legacy. Although he continued to rule for more than a decade after the event and undertook significant building projects in Assyria, including the grand reconstruction of Nineveh, his reputation was permanently marked by his handling of Babylon. Assyrian sources, particularly those written during and after the reign of his successors, reflect an effort to distance the royal house from this act. When Sennacherib was eventually assassinated, an event likely involving one or more of his sons, some later accounts interpreted his violent death as divine retribution for his destruction of Babylon. This interpretation gained further weight when his surviving son and successor, Esarhaddon, took steps to reverse his father's policies. Esarhaddon would not only rebuild Babylon, but would also return the statue of Marduk to the city, re-establish religious rituals, and seek reconciliation with the Babylonian priesthood and populace. These efforts, explored in the next section, marked a dramatic shift in Assyrian policy and attempted to heal the spiritual and political wounds left by Sennacherib's actions. The destruction of Babylon in 689 before the Common Era remains one of the most extreme decisions ever made by an ancient ruler toward a major city within his own realm. It demonstrated the lengths to which Sennacherib was willing to go to assert dominance, eliminate resistance, and reshape the political map of southern Mesopotamia. Yet it also revealed the limitations of brute force. Even after the city's destruction, the idea of Babylon, its culture, its religion, its memory, could not be extinguished. For centuries, Babylon had represented more than just political power. It was a symbol of civilization, a city tied to divine legitimacy and cosmic order. By attempting to erase it from the map, Sennacherib had created a void that his successors would be compelled to fill. Babylon, though in ruins, remained central to the religious psychology of the region. Its absence was as politically dangerous as its rebellion had ever been. The ruins of Babylon, left desolate by Sennacherib's fury, stood as a grim reminder of the costs of imperial wrath. But the ancient city's story was far from over. After its destruction in the late 7th century before the Common Era, a surprising chapter of renewal began under Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon. In stark contrast to his father, Esarhaddon adopted a policy of reconciliation and restoration, both politically and spiritually. His actions would not only revive Babylon, but also alter the course of Assyrian policy toward the city for years to come. Esarhaddon came to the Assyrian throne under dramatic and violent circumstances. Following Sennacherib's assassination, an event shrouded in palace intrigue and possibly involving his own sons, Esarhaddon emerged victorious in the struggle for succession. His ascent to power was not guaranteed. Rival claimants threatened to plunge the empire into chaos. To secure his position, Esarhaddon needed to project strength and divine favor while also correcting what many in the empire, particularly in Babylonia, saw as the theological and moral offenses of his father. From the beginning of his reign, Esarhaddon made it clear that he would take a different path. His inscriptions are filled with language of piety, repentance, and respect for Babylon's sacred traditions. He openly acknowledged the destruction of Babylon and framed its rebuilding as a divinely sanctioned mission. He presented himself as the chosen agent of Marduk, tasked with restoring order and harmony between Assyria and the gods. One of Esarhaddon's first acts as king was to return the statue of Marduk to Babylon. This symbolic gesture had immense religious significance. The removal of the statue years earlier by Sennacherib had not only desecrated the city, but also suggested that the divine presence had abandoned it. By bringing the statue back, Esarhaddon signaled that Marduk's favor had been regained and that Babylon was once again a legitimate religious center. The process of rebuilding Babylon was not immediate. It required years of labor, massive resources, and careful political management. Esarhaddon ordered the restoration of temples, particularly the great Esagila temple complex dedicated to Marduk. The rebuilding was not limited to religious structures. City walls, gates, administrative buildings, and residential quarters were also reconstructed. Esarhaddon's inscriptions detail the ceremonial aspects of the reconstruction. He invoked traditional Babylonian rituals and consulted local priests to ensure that all religious requirements were observed. He emphasized that the rebuilding was not merely an imperial project, but a sacred duty undertaken in accordance with ancient customs and divine instruction. Politically, Esarhaddon sought to mend relations with the Babylonian elite. He restored land and privileges to priestly families who had been displaced or disenfranchised under his father. He also reappointed Babylonian officials to positions of authority, allowing a degree of local governance while maintaining overall Assyrian control. This strategy of inclusion helped stabilize the region. For many Babylonians, Esarhaddon was seen not as an occupier, but as a restorer of justice. His approach succeeded in diffusing much of the animosity that had built up during Sennacherib's reign. While tensions never fully disappeared, the atmosphere in Babylon during Esarhaddon's reign was markedly more peaceful. Esarhaddon also used Babylon as a platform for broader diplomatic initiatives. He sent envoys to Elam and other neighboring powers, attempting to build alliances and reduce the threat of renewed conflict in southern Mesopotamia. These diplomatic efforts were accompanied by military campaigns elsewhere, including notable victories in Egypt. Yet throughout his reign, Babylon remained a priority, a symbol of his desire to rule with both strength and righteousness. Culturally, Babylon experienced a revival. Temples resumed their roles as centers of learning, scribal activity increased, and the city's traditional festivals were celebrated once more. Esarhaddon's court actively supported the transmission of Babylonian scholarship to Assyrian centers like Nineveh. This exchange of knowledge would become even more pronounced under Esarhaddon's son and successor, Ashurbanipal, who would go on to build the famous royal library at Nineveh using texts copied from Babylonian originals. The reconciliation policies of Esarhaddon were not without their critics. Within the Assyrian heartland, some military and political elites likely viewed the investment in Babylon as wasteful or risky. The memory of Babylon's repeated rebellions remained fresh, and fears of future unrest persisted. But Esarhaddon remained committed to his vision of balance, one in which imperial rule was paired with respect for cultural and religious traditions. Toward the end of his reign, Esarhaddon made a carefully orchestrated decision regarding succession. He appointed his eldest son, Shamash-shum-ukin, as king of Babylon, and his younger son, Ashurbanipal, as king of Assyria. This dual kingship arrangement was designed to preserve harmony between the two realms. Babylon would be ruled by a native-born heir, trained in Babylonian customs, while Assyria would remain under direct royal control. Esarhaddon hoped this arrangement would honor Babylonian identity while securing the unity of the empire. In theory, this succession plan was elegant and pragmatic. In practice, it would lead to one of the most dramatic civil wars in Mesopotamian history, a topic addressed in a future section. For now, it is important to note that Esarhaddon's decision reflected his deep understanding of Babylon's importance and his desire to build lasting peace through shared rule. Esarhaddon died during a campaign against Egypt in the early 7th century before the Common Era. His legacy in Babylon, however, endured. He was remembered as a king who, unlike his father, had respected the city's gods, rebuilt its temples, and ruled with justice. His name appears in later Babylonian records not as a foreign oppressor, but as a restorer, an unusual honor for an Assyrian king. The reconstruction of Babylon under Esarhaddon stands as one of the most remarkable episodes in the city's long history. It demonstrated the resilience of Babylonian culture, the power of religious symbolism, and the possibility of reconciliation even after destruction. More than just a political act, The rebuilding of Babylon was a spiritual restoration that reaffirmed the city's place at the center of Mesopotamian civilization. Esarhaddon's plan for peace through shared power was ambitious. By dividing his empire between his two sons, Ashurbanipal ruling in Assyria and Shamash-Shum-Ukin ruling in Babylon, he hoped to balance imperial control with cultural sensitivity. Assyria would retain its military and political supremacy, while Babylon would enjoy nominal independence under a royal heir trained in its traditions. It was a plan designed to avoid conflict, but as history often proves, peace imposed from above rarely endures when ambition, rivalry, and deep cultural divides lie just beneath the surface. Within a generation, Esarhaddon's dual kingship strategy unraveled, and Babylon would once again rise in rebellion, this time in a dramatic and brutal war between brothers. Ashurbanipal succeeded his father in Assyria in the early 7th century before the Common Era. Though young, he quickly proved to be an energetic and effective ruler. A brilliant administrator and ruthless commander, he maintained Assyria's dominance through calculated diplomacy, frequent military campaigns, and a vast intelligence network. Under his reign, Assyria remained the most powerful empire in the Near East. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, the elder brother, was installed as king of Babylon around the same time. Having grown up in the Assyrian court but also trained in Babylonian customs, he was expected to bridge the two worlds. At first, he ruled Babylon in relative peace. He took part in religious rituals, respected Babylonian law, and oversaw the city's continued reconstruction. However, beneath the formal arrangement, resentment began to build. Despite his royal title, Shamash-Shum-Ukin held far less real power than his brother. Ashurbanipal retained control over Assyria's armies, foreign policy, and imperial administration. Babylonian resources were taxed to fund Assyrian wars, and Babylonian nobles remained subordinate to Assyrian officials. The appearance of autonomy masked a continuing dependency. Tensions deepened as Ashurbanipal's influence spread into southern Babylonia, a region traditionally tied to the Chaldeans and other semi-independent groups. Babylonian elites began to question whether their king was truly free or merely a figurehead. For Shamash-Shum-Ukin himself, the humiliation of being overshadowed by a younger brother was compounded by the realization that his kingdom remained politically constrained. By the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era, Shamash-Shum-Ukin had begun to plan open rebellion. He secretly reached out to longtime Assyrian enemies, most notably the Elamites, and forged an anti-Assyrian coalition. He also sought the support of Aramean and Chaldean leaders in southern Babylonia, hoping to revive the spirit of resistance that had fueled earlier uprisings. The rebellion began in earnest around the year 652 before the Common Era. Babylon and its allies rose against Assyrian authority in what would become one of the most widespread and coordinated revolts in the empire's history. For Shamash-Shum-Ukin, this was not just a power struggle. It was a final attempt to establish Babylonian independence and dethrone a brother he saw as an illegitimate usurper. Ashurbanipal responded with swift and overwhelming force. His inscriptions describe a brutal campaign of suppression, emphasizing his divine mandate and military strength. He marched into southern Mesopotamia with veteran troops, systematically isolating Babylon from its allies. He defeated the Elamites in a series of punishing battles, crushed Chaldean resistance, and laid siege to Babylon itself. The siege of Babylon lasted several years and turned into a humanitarian disaster. Famine, disease, and internal chaos tore through the city. Shamash-Shum-Ukin's coalition crumbled as support from outside powers collapsed. Eventually, Babylon fell. Ashurbanipal captured the city and inflicted harsh punishment. While the details of Shamash-Shum-Ukin's fate are debated, Assyrian sources claim he perished in the flames of his own palace, choosing death over surrender. The aftermath of the rebellion was devastating. Babylon, though not destroyed as it had been under Sennacherib, suffered immensely. Its temples were looted, its leaders executed or exiled, and its political autonomy revoked. Ashurbanipal reasserted full Assyrian control, installing loyal governors and dismantling the last vestiges of independent Babylonian kingship. Culturally, however, Babylon remained indispensable. Ashurbanipal, despite his brutal suppression, continued to promote Babylonian scholarship. He famously amassed thousands of tablets from Babylonian temples and scribal schools for his great library at Nineveh. Many of the texts that survive today, epic poems, legal codes, astronomical charts, were preserved because of this effort. In this sense, Babylon's intellectual legacy was ironically preserved by the very empire that crushed its political ambitions. The rebellion of Shamash-Shum-Ukin was the final major attempt by a Babylonian ruler to defy Assyria before the empire's eventual decline. It marked the end of Babylon as an independent power during the Neo-Assyrian period. Though still revered as a religious center, Babylon became more of an imperial possession than a partner in governance. Yet the ideals that Shamash-Shum-Ukin embodied, cultural pride, local autonomy, and religious legitimacy, did not disappear. They lingered in Babylonian memory, reinforced by centuries of resistance. Even as Assyrian governors ruled from the city, many Babylonians waited for the day when a native king might once again restore their ancient sovereignty. Ashurbanipal ruled for many more years, expanding his empire and securing its borders. But the seeds of decline had already been planted. The costs of constant warfare, growing resentment among subjugated peoples, and internal strain would soon begin to tear at the foundations of Assyria. In the decades following the suppression of Shamash-Shum-Ukin's rebellion, the Assyrian Empire remained the dominant power in the Near East. Yet beneath its outward strength, the empire was cracking. The burdens of constant warfare, internal dissent, and overextended administration began to weaken the structures that had supported Assyrian supremacy for generations. In the south, amid these fractures, Babylon was about to rise once more, this time under the leadership of a Chaldean general named Nabopolassar. His rebellion would not only free Babylon from Assyrian control, but bring about the final collapse of the Assyrian Empire itself. The final years of the 7th century before the Common Era were marked by chaos within Assyria. After the death of Ashurbanipal, who had maintained tight control over his vast empire, a series of weak and short-lived rulers ascended the throne. Civil war, dynastic conflict, and foreign pressures undermined Assyrian cohesion. The once mighty empire found itself struggling to maintain authority over its own territories. In this volatile environment, local leaders in various regions began to assert their independence. One of these was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean military commander who had likely risen through the ranks of the Assyrian army or provincial administration in Babylonia. By the year 626 before the Common Era, he declared himself king of Babylon. His proclamation was not simply a local coup, it was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated rebellion. Nabopolassar's legitimacy stemmed from both political acumen and deep-rooted resentment among Babylonians toward Assyrian rule. His Chaldean background connected him with powerful tribal alliances in southern Mesopotamia, while his position in Babylon gave him access to the city's priesthood, scribes, and urban population. He swiftly moved to consolidate power, rallying Babylonian support and forming a coalition of anti-Assyrian forces. Assyria, now under the rule of Sin-shar-ishkun, responded with a series of military campaigns aimed at recapturing Babylon. However, these efforts failed. Nabopolassar proved an effective military leader, using both traditional city defenses and mobile forces drawn from tribal allies. The geography of southern Mesopotamia, marked by marshes, canals, and narrow passes, favored defenders familiar with the terrain. Despite Assyria's initial advantages in numbers and experience, it could not overcome the deeply rooted opposition or the complex logistics of a protracted campaign far from its core. As Nabopolassar held firm in the south, a new and unexpected opportunity emerged in the north. The Medes, an Indo-Iranian people who had long been subject to Assyrian pressure, launched their own rebellion. Led by King Cyaxares, the Medes swept across eastern Assyria, capturing city after city. In an unprecedented development, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares formed an alliance. This Babylonian-Median coalition combined military strength, shared interests, and a mutual desire to dismantle Assyria's imperial power once and for all. The joint military campaign that followed was methodical and devastating. Beginning in the mid-620s before the Common Era, the coalition forces pushed northward, besieging and capturing key Assyrian cities. The heart of the empire, cities like Arapha, Kalhu, and eventually Nineveh itself, became battlegrounds. In the year 612 before the Common Era, the allied armies reached Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The siege lasted several months and culminated in the complete fall of the city. According to later sources, the destruction was thorough. The city's palaces, temples, and archives were looted and burned. Sin-shar-ishkun is believed to have died during the fighting. The capital of Assyria was no more. With the fall of Nineveh, Assyria's central administration collapsed. Remnants of the royal family fled westward and established a temporary seat of power at Haran. Yet even there, they could not hold out. Nabopolassar and Kyaxares pursued their campaign relentlessly. In the year 609 before the Common Era, Haran fell as well, effectively ending the Assyrian state. The final blow came when the remaining Assyrian forces, bolstered by their Egyptian allies, attempted one last stand. Egypt, which had its own interests in maintaining a buffer against Babylonian expansion, had aligned itself with the remnants of the Assyrian royal family. But the coalition of Babylon and the Medes once again prevailed. The final battles, fought in northern Syria and along the upper Euphrates, extinguished the last vestiges of Assyrian resistance. With Assyria defeated, Nabopolassar had accomplished what generations of Babylonian rulers had failed to do. He had not only restored Babylonian independence, but destroyed the empire that had dominated the region for over a century. His victory was a watershed moment in Mesopotamian history, a complete reversal of fortunes for Babylon, now reborn as the center of a new imperial power. Politically, Nabopolassar set about consolidating his gains. He reorganized the administration, rebuilt cities damaged in the wars, and restored temples. The priesthood, long suppressed or manipulated by foreign rulers, was reinstated as a central institution of governance. The cult of Marduk was re-established with full honors, and the image of the god was returned to its rightful place in the Asagila temple. Nabopolassar also passed on a stable and secure kingdom to his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. The succession was smooth and without civil conflict, marking a rare and remarkable moment of unity in Babylonian political history. This transfer of power ensured that the Neo-Babylonian Empire, founded in revolution, would endure. Though Nabopolassar is often overshadowed by his more famous son, his role in history is foundational. He brought an end to the Assyrian domination that had cast a shadow over Babylon for more than a century. He re-established native kingship and laid the administrative, religious, and military groundwork for the golden age that was to come. The rise of Nabopolassar was more than a military achievement. It was a cultural and psychological restoration. For the first time in generations, Babylon stood at the center of its own destiny. The memory of past humiliations under Assyrian rule began to fade, replaced by the pride of a city once again ascendant. When Nebuchadnezzar II ascended the throne of Babylon, he inherited a revitalized kingdom forged through the military triumphs and political reforms of his father, Nabopolassar. But while Nabopolassar had laid the foundation for Babylon's independence and resurgence, it would be Nebuchadnezzar who transformed the city into the beating heart of a powerful and ambitious empire. Under his long and eventful reign, Babylon reached the zenith of its political power, architectural grandeur, and cultural influence, becoming the defining symbol of Mesopotamian civilization in both contemporary and later memory. Nebuchadnezzar II began his reign in the early 6th century, before the Common Era, shortly after participating in decisive military campaigns that concluded the final chapter of Assyrian resistance. One of his earliest acts as king was the continuation of campaigns in the west, particularly in the regions of Syria and the Levant. These efforts were aimed at consolidating Babylon's influence over former Assyrian territories, and expanding control over vital trade routes. The military genius of Nebuchadnezzar was evident from the outset. He quickly brought rebellious cities under control and re-established Babylonian authority in strategic locations, including along the Mediterranean coast. His conquests included territory in modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Egypt's frontier zones. The Babylonian army, well-trained and supported by a strong logistical network, became a dominant force across the Near East. Among the most consequential of Nebuchadnezzar's Western campaigns was his series of confrontations with the Kingdom of Judah. In the early years of his reign, Babylon was drawn into the internal politics of the region, especially as smaller states attempted to resist imperial control. Judah, caught between the fading power of Egypt and the expanding influence of Babylon, vacillated in its loyalties, an indecision that would ultimately prove disastrous. After several failed revolts and repeated defiance by the kings of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar launched a full-scale campaign against Jerusalem. The city was besieged, and after years of resistance, it was finally captured. The Temple of Solomon, the most sacred site in Judahite religion, was destroyed. Many inhabitants, particularly the elite classes and priesthood, were taken into exile and relocated to Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian exile, marked a defining trauma in Jewish history and is remembered in religious and historical texts as a turning point in the spiritual and political life of the Jewish people. While the exile is a major legacy of Nebuchadnezzar's reign from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible, from a Babylonian point of view, it was part of a broader imperial strategy. By relocating conquered peoples and integrating them into the empire, Nebuchadnezzar weakened local resistance and strengthened the administrative reach of Babylon. The exiles were often employed in skilled labor, agriculture, and temple service, contributing to the economy and infrastructure of the empire. Domestically, Nebuchadnezzar devoted vast resources to the transformation of Babylon itself. The city became one of the most architecturally and symbolically impressive capitals in the ancient world. With a keen eye for design and a commitment to glorifying both the state and its gods, Nebuchadnezzar undertook ambitious building projects that reshaped the urban landscape. One of the most renowned constructions of his reign was the Ishtar Gate, a monumental entrance to the inner city decorated with rows of glazed bricks depicting lions, dragons, and bulls, each representing different deities in the Babylonian pantheon. The gate was part of a grand processional way that led to the Esagila temple complex, the central religious sanctuary of Marduk. These projects were not merely aesthetic, they served a political purpose by demonstrating royal power, religious devotion, and imperial stability. Nebuchadnezzar also undertook the restoration and enlargement of Babylon's defensive walls, which he claimed were so wide that chariots could ride atop them side by side. He improved canals, irrigation systems, and granaries to ensure food security for the growing population. His inscriptions emphasize his role as a caretaker of the gods and protector of the people, linking his rule to divine mandate and the well-being of the realm. Perhaps the most enduring legend tied to Nebuchadnezzar's name is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the so-called 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to later Greek historians, the gardens were built to please a queen who missed the green hills of her homeland, possibly a Median or Persian wife. While the actual existence of the gardens has not been definitively confirmed by archaeological evidence, the story reflects the grandeur associated with Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Whether real or mythologized, the gardens symbolize the king's ability to bend nature itself to imperial aesthetics. Nebuchadnezzar's relationship with the priesthood and temple institutions remained central to his rule. He made regular offerings to Marduk, oversaw religious festivals such as the New Year's celebration, and funded temple renovations across the empire. In return, he was presented in official inscriptions as the chosen of the gods, the restorer of cosmic order, and the guarantor of prosperity. The Babylonian worldview placed the king at the center of a divine human partnership, and Nebuchadnezzar fully embraced this role. Culturally, the Neo-Babylonian period under his leadership witnessed a flowering of scholarship, literature, and religious codification. The scribal schools, libraries, and astronomical observatories of Babylon continued to produce and preserve vast bodies of knowledge. Scholars studied the stars, recorded omens, copied ancient epics, and administered the growing bureaucracy with remarkable precision. Despite his successes, Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not without strain. The enormous resources poured into military and architectural endeavors likely placed pressure on the empire's agricultural base and labor force. Furthermore, the relocation of various populations, including the exiles from Judah and other regions, required careful management to avoid unrest. Yet no major revolts or external invasions appear to have threatened his authority during his lifetime. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for over 4 decades, a period of remarkable continuity in an age often marked by rapid political turnover. His death marked the beginning of a more uncertain chapter in Babylonian history. Subsequent kings would struggle to maintain the empire's cohesion and grandeur. But Nebuchadnezzar's legacy endured, not only in stone and inscription, but in the memory of those he ruled and those he conquered. He is remembered in different ways by different cultures. In Babylonian records, he is praised as a builder, a protector, and a devout servant of the gods. In biblical tradition, he appears as both a destroyer and an instrument of divine will. In later Persian and Greek texts, he emerges as a symbol of ancient imperial power. These varied perspectives reflect the wide impact of his reign and the enduring complexity of his character. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, Babylon was not merely the capital of an empire. It was the largest and most advanced city in the known world. Its influence reached far beyond the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, not only through military conquest, but also through its immense cultural, scientific, and religious achievements. To understand Babylon during its golden age, one must look beyond its towering temples and gleaming gates to the rhythms of daily life, the practices of its priesthood, and the intellectual traditions that helped define ancient Mesopotamian civilization. At the heart of Babylonian society stood its religion. Every aspect of life was deeply intertwined with a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses. Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon, held supreme authority, but he was part of a larger divine assembly that included figures such as Ishtar, god of love and war, Nabu, god of wisdom and writing, Shamash, god of the sun and justice, and Ea, god of wisdom and fresh water. Temples dedicated to these deities were not just places of worship. They functioned as administrative centers, economic hubs, and educational institutions. The Asagila Temple of Marduk stood at the center of Babylon's religious and civic life. Maintained by a large priesthood, it hosted daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and royal ceremonies. The priests were not merely spiritual leaders, they were scholars, landowners, and officials responsible for interpreting omens, maintaining temple lands, and overseeing legal transactions. Their education, often conducted in temple-affiliated scribal schools, was rigorous and rooted in centuries of tradition. One of the most distinctive features of Babylonian scholarship was its focus on divination and astrology. The Babylonians believed that the gods communicated their will through natural signs, especially the movements of celestial bodies. Astronomers, who were often members of the priestly class, carefully recorded the positions of the stars, planets, and moon, comparing these observations with historical events to detect patterns and divine intentions. Babylonian astronomers developed a remarkably precise understanding of lunar cycles and planetary motion. They created detailed star catalogs and devised mathematical systems for predicting eclipses and celestial conjunctions. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a vast series of omen texts, connected astronomical phenomena with political and natural outcomes, forming one of the earliest attempts at empirical forecasting. These practices laid the groundwork for later developments in Greek, Islamic, and European astronomy. Babylon was also a city of writing. Cuneiform, the ancient script first developed by the Sumerians, remained the primary medium for record-keeping, literature, law, and administration. Scribes trained for years to master the thousands of characters required to read and write fluently. The city's scribal schools, known as edubas, taught students using a curriculum that included legal contracts, lexical lists, religious hymns, proverbs, and epic literature. The libraries of Babylon, many of them attached to temples or royal palaces, preserved copies of some of the most famous literary works of the ancient world. These included the Epic of Gilgamesh, creation myths such as the Enuma Elish, and moral texts that reflected the values of justice, loyalty, and wisdom. The act of copying these works was not just an educational exercise. It was a means of preserving cultural memory and participating in the transmission of divine knowledge. In terms of daily life, Babylon was a bustling urban center filled with traders, craftsmen, farmers, officials, soldiers, and slaves. Its streets were lined with mud brick houses, workshops, open-air markets, and administrative buildings. The city was organized according to districts, many of which were associated with specific temples or professional guilds. Markets offered goods from across the empire and beyond, grains from the southern plains, timber from the north, spices from Arabia, and copper from the Persian Gulf. Social structure in Babylonian society was hierarchical but fluid. At the top were the royal family and high officials, followed by priests, wealthy landowners, and skilled artisans. Merchants played a crucial role in the economy and often enjoyed significant autonomy. Below them were farmers, laborers, and scribes. At the bottom of the hierarchy were slaves, many of whom had been captured in warfare or born into servitude. However, Babylonian slavery was not always permanent. Some slaves could earn their freedom, own property, and even conduct business. Women in Babylonian society had varied roles depending on their class and context. While elite women often participated in temple service or managed estates, common women engaged in textile production, food preparation, and market trade. Legal documents show that women could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in contracts, although their rights were generally more limited than those of men. Family life was central to Babylonian culture. Households were typically multi-generational, and marriage was seen as both a social and economic arrangement. Dowries and bride prices were common, and contracts spelled out the responsibilities of both husband and wife. Children were expected to honor their parents, and family reputation carried significant weight in legal and social matters. Babylonian law, based on centuries of precedent, was codified in various legal texts. Judges administered justice in public forums, often in the presence of witnesses and scribes. Cases ranged from property disputes to inheritance claims, debt arrangements, and accusations of theft or assault. Although the earlier Code of Hammurabi remained influential, later legal traditions adapted its principles to contemporary realities. Infrastructure in Babylon was highly advanced. The city was crisscrossed by canals, used for both irrigation and transportation. Roads linked major districts, and bridges allowed movement across waterways. Public works, including drainage systems and storage facilities, ensured that the city could manage seasonal floods and support a growing population. Skilled laborers, including brickmakers, masons, and carpenters, played a vital role in maintaining the city's grandeur. Religious festivals marked the Babylonian calendar and brought the population together in acts of collective identity. The most important of these was the Akitu, or New Year festival, which symbolized the renewal of kingship and the cosmic order. Lasting several days, the Akitu involved elaborate processions, ritual humiliation of the king before the statue of Marduk, and reenactments of mythological battles. These festivals reinforced social bonds, affirmed royal legitimacy, and reconnected the community with its divine protectors. Babylon's openness to cultural exchange helped fuel its prosperity. Merchants and travelers from across the ancient world came to its gates, bringing with them new ideas, goods, and technologies. While maintaining its core identity, the city absorbed and integrated these influences, making it a dynamic and cosmopolitan center. Yet even during this golden age, challenges remained. Social inequality, dependency on large-scale agriculture, and the strain of imperial expansion left Babylon vulnerable to future instability. As the empire passed into the hands of weaker successors, these cracks would widen. Still, at its height, Babylon, under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, stood as a marvel of human achievement. Its scholars mapped the stars, its architects reshaped the earth, and its priests preserved a spiritual worldview that had evolved over millennia. Life in Babylon was not always easy, but it was richly layered, deeply meaningful, and woven into the vast tapestry of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Following the remarkable achievements of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon entered a period of transition. The city remained prosperous, culturally vibrant, and administratively functional, but its political stability began to erode. The final decades of the Neo-Babylonian Empire were marked by court intrigue, religious controversy, and widening discontent among key factions. At the heart of this turbulent period stood a king whose reign was both unconventional and divisive, Nabonidus. His rule would culminate in the dramatic and largely peaceful conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great, marking the end of Babylonian political independence. Nabonidus came to the throne in the mid-6th century before the Common Era under circumstances that are still not entirely clear. He was not a member of the royal line of Nebuchadnezzar, and his rise may have involved court maneuvering or factional support from outside the traditional elite. What is known is that Nabonidus was a scholar, deeply religious, and unusually devoted to the moon god Sin, whose principal cult centers were located in Haran and Ur. From the outset, Nabonidus's religious policies caused tension. The Babylonian religious establishment had long centered on the worship of Marduk, and the king's role was defined through rituals associated with Marduk's temple, especially during the New Year festival. Nabonidus, however, showed clear preference for Sin, commissioning temples in his honor and shifting royal devotion toward this deity. While the king's personal piety was genuine, it alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk and disrupted the traditional religious calendar. The most controversial episode of Nabonidus's reign occurred when he left Babylon for a prolonged period, an act almost without precedent. Around the 10th year of his rule, he withdrew from the capital and relocated to the city of Tama in northwestern Arabia, where he remained for approximately a decade. The reasons for this move are debated. Some suggest it was for religious reasons, linked to his veneration of Sin. Others argue it was a political retreat or a strategic attempt to control trade routes in the Arabian Peninsula. During his absence, Nabonidus left his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon. Belshazzar appears in various administrative documents and is known from later biblical tradition as the ruler present during the city's fall. However, Belshazzar was not formally crowned king and lacked full authority, leading to a prolonged period of unclear leadership. This dual structure of absentee kingship and delegated authority proved problematic. The rituals of kingship required the monarch's physical presence, particularly during the annual Akitu festival. Without the king, the symbolic renewal of order between the gods and the state could not be fully performed. As years passed, frustration grew among the clergy, the nobility, and ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, beyond the empire's borders, a new power was rising. In the east, the Persian ruler Cyrus had united the tribes of the Iranian plateau and begun expanding his domain. He first conquered the Medes, then turned westward, defeating the Lydian king Croesus and asserting control over Anatolia. Cyrus's campaigns were swift, strategic, and remarkably effective. He built a reputation not only as a conqueror, but also as a liberator and reformer, offering tolerance to conquered peoples and working with local elites rather than against them. As Cyrus approached Babylonian territory, he found a population that was divided and, in many cases, disillusioned with their king. Nabonidus's religious reforms had weakened his legitimacy. His long absence had undermined his authority. Economic management during this period had also faltered, with records showing signs of strain in temple finances and local administration. By the time Nabonidus returned to Babylon, the empire's internal cohesion had frayed. Cyrus advanced toward Babylon through a combination of diplomacy and military pressure. He was able to co-opt allies within the empire, including local governors, military leaders, and possibly segments of the priesthood. The exact details of his approach remain debated, but the final outcome is clear. In the year 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus entered Babylon without resistance. The city fell not through siege or destruction, but through surrender, likely negotiated by disaffected Babylonian elites who saw Cyrus as a more legitimate ruler than Nabonidus. The Cyrus Cylinder, an inscription commissioned by the new Persian ruler, presents his conquest in terms of restoration. Cyrus claimed to have been chosen by Marduk to liberate Babylon from oppression. He portrayed Nabonidus as impious and disruptive, and himself as a restorer of order and proper religious practice. The text emphasizes Cyrus's respect for Babylonian traditions, his commitment to temple restoration, and his peaceful entry into the city. Nabonidus was captured and exiled, possibly to the region of Carmania in southern Iran. Belshazzar, who had acted as co-regent, disappears from the historical record and may have been killed during the transfer of power. Despite their downfall, there is no evidence of mass retribution or widespread destruction. Cyrus allowed temples to continue functioning, honored local gods, and integrated Babylon into the Achaemenid imperial structure with remarkable subtlety. For the Babylonians, the conquest marked both an end and a beginning. Politically, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was finished. Babylon would never again serve as the capital of an independent Mesopotamian state. Yet culturally and administratively, the city remained central. Under Persian rule, Babylon retained its economic importance, its scholarly institutions, and its religious prestige. The priests of Marduk regained their influence, and traditional rituals resumed. The archives continued to function, producing cuneiform documents well into the Hellenistic period. In fact, some of the best preserved astronomical and economic records from Babylon date from the centuries following the Persian conquest. This continuity speaks to the strength of Babylonian institutions and the pragmatism of the Persian imperial policy. The peaceful nature of Cyrus's conquest also shaped his reputation in history. In contrast to the brutal tactics of earlier empires, the Persians adopted a strategy of accommodation. Cyrus respected the autonomy of local traditions and presented himself as a servant of the gods of every land he ruled. His legacy as a model ruler endured in many cultures, from Babylonian scribes to Greek historians and later religious texts. For the Babylonians, however, the loss of independence was not without sorrow. The fall of the dynasty that had liberated the city from Assyrian domination and built its golden age was a moment of reflection. The grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's empire, the long-standing cultural achievements, and the deeply rooted identity of Babylon as a sovereign power were now part of the past. Yet Babylon was not forgotten nor abandoned. Its influence would continue to ripple through history, through the works of its astronomers, the memory of its kings, and the myths preserved in ancient texts. Though Babylon lost its independence with the conquest by Cyrus the Great, its story did not end there. In many ways, the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire marked the beginning of Babylon's afterlife, its transformation from a living imperial capital into a powerful cultural symbol. For centuries to come, Babylon would live on in the myths of ancient civilizations, the sacred texts of major religions, and the discoveries of modern archaeology. Its name, more than most cities of antiquity, became a byword for greatness, mystery, excess, and divine judgment. Under Persian rule, Babylon continued to function as a vital city within the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians, particularly Cyrus and his successors, showed remarkable deference to Babylonian religious traditions. The temples were maintained, the priesthood retained its authority, and traditional rituals continued, especially those associated with Marduk. Babylon even served on occasion as a royal residence and administrative center for Persian satraps governing the region. Cuneiform tablets from this period reveal that Babylonian scribes, scholars, and astronomers remained active. They continued producing sophisticated mathematical and astronomical texts, refining techniques of celestial observation that had developed over many centuries. Some of the most precise eclipse records and planetary tables ever written emerged during this time, laying the groundwork for the later scientific advances in Hellenistic and Islamic astronomy. However, over time, Babylon's prominence began to decline. Under Seleucid and then Parthian rule, the city gradually lost its political and economic importance. New power centers emerged, including Seleucia on the Tigris and later Ctesiphon. Temples fell into disrepair, population centers shifted, and the once glorious infrastructure deteriorated. By the end of the classical era, Babylon had become a shadow of its former self. Yet Babylon's symbolic power only grew stronger. The city was immortalized in the Hebrew Bible, where it took on a dual character, both historical empire and moral allegory. On one hand, Babylon was remembered as the place of exile, where the Judeans were taken after the destruction of Jerusalem. This period of captivity shaped Jewish identity and theology profoundly, contributing to the development of key biblical texts and the consolidation of monotheism. On the other hand, Babylon became a symbol of arrogance, idolatry, and divine punishment. The biblical book of Isaiah foretells the city's fall in poetic and apocalyptic language, while the book of Daniel presents Babylon as a place of trial and revelation, where the faithful resist the temptations and decrees of a foreign king. In the book of Revelation, written centuries later, Babylon the Great reappears as a metaphor for a corrupt world order destined for destruction. In these texts, Babylon was no longer just a place, it was an idea, a warning, and a prophecy. This moral transformation of Babylon in the Jewish and Christian traditions shaped Western perceptions for centuries. To many in medieval and early modern Europe, Babylon represented the antithesis of divine order, a city of sin, pride, and ultimate downfall. The phrase "whore of Babylon," used in Revelation, became a potent symbol in religious polemic, aimed at various institutions or enemies depending on the era. Islamic tradition also preserved Babylon's memory, though in a different form. Early Islamic scholars translated many Babylonian astronomical and mathematical works, ensuring their survival and influence. The Quran refers to Babylon as the location where two angels taught mankind sorcery as a test, emphasizing the city's association with ancient knowledge and spiritual risk. Babylon thus occupied a space in Islamic thought as a place of both learning and temptation. While Babylon's memory endured in religious and literary texts, its physical location was largely forgotten by the West. Ancient Greek historians, such as Herodotus and Ctesias, wrote of its magnificence, but over time, these accounts were mingled with myth and speculation. By the Renaissance, Babylon was more a fabled ruin than a geographical site, often imagined in fantastical or allegorical terms. It was not until the modern era that the real city began to re-emerge from beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. In the 19th century, European explorers and scholars, inspired by both biblical references and classical descriptions, began to search for Babylon's remains. Through surveys and excavations, they identified the site near the modern city of Hilla in Iraq. The most significant breakthrough came in the early 20th century, when German archaeologist Robert Koldewey led a systematic excavation of Babylon over a span of nearly 2 decades. His work uncovered monumental architecture that matched ancient descriptions. The foundations of the Ishtar Gate, sections of the processional way, the remains of massive walls, and the outlines of palace complexes. Though much had been lost, the scale and sophistication of the ruins confirmed Babylon's historical grandeur. Koldewey's discoveries, along with ongoing archaeological research, helped reconstruct a clearer image of the ancient city. Artifacts were transported to European museums, most notably the Ishtar Gate, which was painstakingly rebuilt in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. While this practice is now subject to ethical debate, it undeniably brought renewed global attention to Babylon's legacy. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Babylon has continued to be a site of both scholarly interest and political tension. During periods of conflict in Iraq, the site suffered damage due to neglect, looting, and even military occupation. Nonetheless, efforts have been made to protect and restore its ruins, and Babylon was finally designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the early 21st century. Today, Babylon stands as a paradox. It is both a ruined city and a timeless symbol, a once living capital of empire and a metaphor for human ambition, fallibility, and memory. It represents the heights of ancient science, art, and administration, while also serving as a cautionary tale in religious and moral literature. Its legacy survives not only in books and ruins, but in the very words we use. The term Babylonian still evokes thoughts of mystery, excess, and antiquity. To speak in Babylonian confusion is to refer to a world of complexity and misunderstanding, a reference to the biblical Tower of Babel, which itself was based on ancient ziggurats like the Etemenenki of Babylon. The story of Babylon is not just a chronicle of rulers, wars, and monuments. It is a history of continuity and change, of fragile empires and resilient culture, of human ambition shaped and often humbled by time. From its modest beginnings as a small city among the floodplains of Mesopotamia to its rise as a capital of empires, Babylon witnessed the unfolding of some of the most transformative developments in human civilization. Over more than 1,000 years, Babylon evolved through many phases: a regional power under the Amorites, a legal and administrative model under Hammurabi, a symbol of resistance under Chaldean kings, and finally a jewel within the Persian Empire. Each phase carried forward what came before, even as it adapted to new realities. Its survival, despite repeated invasions, betrayals, and defeats, speaks to a society that knew how to endure. Babylon's story is also the story of institutions. Unlike many ancient powers that disappeared without a trace, Babylon built systems of writing, law, astronomy, and religion that outlived its political independence. The legal codes etched in stone, the astronomical tables recorded in cuneiform, the myths copied by generations of scribes. These were not just tools of governance or belief, but forms of memory. They allowed the city's voice to echo long after its armies had disbanded. There are several enduring lessons to draw from Babylon's history. First, empire is temporary, but culture can be lasting. The Babylonians were ruled by Amorites, Kassites, Assyrians, and Persians. But each successive ruler, to some extent, adopted Babylonian customs, respected its temples, and preserved its intellectual traditions. Even conquerors recognized that Babylon's value lay not just in its walls and wealth, but in its ideas. Second, political power without legitimacy is inherently unstable. Time and again, Babylon resisted foreign rulers who failed to honor local customs or religious expectations. Kings who tried to impose their authority without the support of temple institutions or the broader public eventually faced rebellion. This tension between governance and consent, between statecraft and cultural legitimacy, remains relevant in every era. Third, memory matters. Babylon became more than a city. It became a symbol. For some, it represented divine punishment for human pride. For others, it was a lost world of wisdom and beauty. Its image shaped religious thought, artistic imagination, and political rhetoric for millennia. What people remember about Babylon, even when mythologized or distorted, shaped how later generations understood their own place in history. And finally, Babylon reminds us of the complexity of the ancient world. Too often, early civilizations are reduced to caricatures, cruel tyrants, static societies, or simple moral allegories. The real Babylon was neither flawless nor monstrous. It was a society of thinkers and builders, of administrators and farmers, of poets and priests. It was deeply human, with all the contradictions, aspirations, and limitations that being human entails. Today, the ruins of Babylon still stand in the Iraqi desert, weathered by centuries and marked by the scars of conflict and neglect. Yet the name lives on, in literature, in languages, in collective memory. Scholars continue to translate its texts. Artists and writers revisit its stories. Historians debate its meanings. In the end, Babylon is a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but the ideas they leave behind can endure. Its legacy challenges us to reflect not only on how power is gained and lost, but also on how knowledge is preserved, how identity is sustained, and how the echoes of the past continue to shape our understanding of the present. This has been the story of Babylon, not as a myth or a cautionary tale, but as a civilization that helped define what it means to be a society. Its questions remain ours. How should we live together? What is justice? Who holds power, and why? In seeking those answers, we are, in some sense, still walking the streets of Babylon.